Dune Awakening is coming out in early 2025 and I got a chance to play it. Today I'm going to tell you about my experience in the early stages of the game in closed beta and give you a good estimation of what you can expect when you first set foot on Arrakis. Firstly though, the footage in the background is not mine. Funcom recently had a hands-on event for press and creators in Oslo, and for those that weren't there, this footage was provided by them. This footage is also from a developmental build, so it's not the final product yet. If you want to wishlist the game or sign up for the closed beta testing yourself, you can find both on the Dune Awakening store page, which I'll link in the description. So, where to begin? I think the first thing that is important to cover is that initial feeling. The first feeling you'll get when you land on Arrakis is an overwhelming feeling of danger, and honestly that has permeated throughout my entire early experience so far. The first impression of any survival world is super important, and when I go into a new survival title I'm looking for really one of three things: to be amazed, to want to explore, or to be terrified. Dune Awakening hits that terrifying feeling really well, just because of the experience it immediately presents to you. The open sands are dangerous, you can hear the worm rumbling, you can see the worm sign as sand kicks up and shapes form and dissipate beneath the dunes, and you can sometimes even see the worm breach fairly regularly, presumably chasing other survivors through the sands. The refuge you have to seek, the rock islands, are themselves pretty dangerous. The design of the rocks form these really sharp shapes and towering spires, structures that look like they'd be places you really don't want to go. It almost reminds me in a way of hostile architecture, buildings and structures that are designed to keep people away and dissuade you from going there. Of course, the irony is that you want to go to these really hostile looking places because, if not, you're going to get munched by the worm. These islands are also packed with scavenger camps, dangerous falls, and are of course, again, surrounded by the worm-infested sands. Couple that with the fight for water and the constant beating heat of the sun, alongside airships crashing, Sardaukar ships roaming the night, and that constant rumbling of the sandworms, you're in for a pretty nail-biting experience from jump. In terms of actual gameplay, the core mechanics are pretty simple yet effective. Movement is quite snappy, a little lighter than something like Conan Exiles, but it still feels grounded. Climbing is pretty good too, nice and fluid, you can move up, down and around surfaces easily, and you will be doing a lot of climbing, especially in the early game. Combat is pretty straightforward and simple. The game gives you some early options for melee combat with a knife and a ranged combat option with a Mauler pistol too. Combat gets a little more complex as you get deeper, especially as you are able to unlock more of your class abilities or abilities of other classes if you find the teachers. Resource gathering through mining is super easy and quite satisfying to be honest, and crafting is also relatively simple too. Building is also quite easy, a little slower than something like Conan Exiles, so that trade-off comes with the benefit of being able to pre-plan your base with holograms before you spend the actual resources to begin construction. Aside from the worm, the sun, the constant pressure of thirst, and fighting off scavengers, you also have the risk of the occasional sandstorms that roll through. These are huge and very impressive. They're not universal, they won't hit the entire map at once, but they'll come through different sections. To be honest, if you're observant, they're quite easy to dodge at times. However, when you hear that sandstorm warning come on your comms and actually see this enormous storm hurtling towards you, it's as impressive as it is terrifying, more so of the latter if you've been caught unaware. You absolutely do not want to be out in the storm. The early stages of Dune Awakening are a bit unlike a standard survival game experience. Instead, the game gives you a decent run of tasks to undertake that aren't mandatory to do right then and there. You're not locked into an instant quest, but they will guide you through the early segments of crafting new armour, a knife, building your first base, so on and so forth. These tasks are mandatory really to get out of the starter area, but if you don't want to do them immediately, you of course don't have to. What I think Dune does really well so far is that mixture of danger with the desire to push further, explore and gather resources. You're far from reaching the PvE or political endgame the devs have mentioned in some of the interviews, but I think the struggle to survive itself and the journey towards that endgame are, so far, pretty compelling. The world of Arrakis is frankly terrifying, especially when you have to cross the sands. It feels like every trip outside the relative safety of your base, and especially when you do have to wander into worm territory, is a real gamble of the things you've achieved thus far. Can I make it through this scavenger camp and get all the loot with the knife and darts I have? Should I risk running to that island, or will the worm erupt from the ground and devour me first? Even vehicles don't make you safe. I've sat on my sandbike many times, watching for worm sign in the distance, just waiting for the perfect moment where I can really reduce my chances of getting eaten. The stakes feel genuine, and I think that's what makes the early game experience so compelling. Dune is touted as a survival MMO, and I think it balances the best parts of both genres thus far. The struggle to survive feels real, with actual risk and proper stakes. As for the MMO section, I've always found the early game experience of most MMOs to be quite tedious, as if the game just kinda wants me to rush for the late game and actually get into the content. I think Dune actually dodges that well, and kinda makes me enjoy the gathering, the building up, trying to get resources and water and wealth, whilst also knowing that I'm risking a lot of it most of the time. The desert setting itself is really oppressive, but in a good way. You are constantly at the mercy of the environment, the sun and thirst, and the worm and the sandstorms, and so far in my time in the beta, that hasn't let up once. The environment feels actually dangerous, and almost everything you do has some degree of risk-reward to it. You can tilt the odds in your favour with gear, planning, but you're almost always at the mercy of this planet, and I think that is a great way to translate Arrakis into a game. I can't really talk about much beyond the early game yet, but from what I've played thus far, Dune manages to tactfully sidestep the pitfall of the early game feeling like something you just need to get past. It's something that I actively felt like I wanted to be a part of, and I enjoyed that feeling of progression as I got my hands on water, metal, weapons, etc. Most importantly, the world thus far really captures what I think people are going to want from Arrakis. This is a dangerous planet, and the game doesn't let you forget it. The sound of Sardaukar ships, the rumbling of the worm, airships getting blown out of the sky, spice erupting from across the sands, the feeling of the world being a hazardous and dynamic place is nearly inescapable, and I don't have a clip of it, but those Sardaukar ships jump scare me every single time they catch me. If you want Arrakis to feel dangerous, then I think Funcom have nailed that aspect so far. I imagine some facets will get easier as you progress into the game, dealing with water, finding shelter, etc., but you're never going to be the apex predator of this world. I think that's quite an engaging feeling. The gameplay loop thus far in the early game is all about survival, getting those essentials in place so you don't die of thirst or get baked by the sun, but once those core needs are fulfilled, the game changes tact to more of a resource-focused design, where you'll want to start getting your hands on metals, crafting materials, and increasingly more valuable and complex items you can use to better yourself and your gear. To that end, whilst the initial stretch is about making you safe, the rest of the game I've played thus far seems geared towards continually pushing the boundaries of your comfort zone, encouraging you out into the world to clear camps or other large points of interest and gather the resources you need to make a step upwards. These tasks really sit on the bleeding edge of the comfort zone, and just when you get comfortable again, the game encourages you to do just a little more, constantly braving the scorched world of Arrakis and its many sandworms to try and bolster your own standing. I imagine this gameplay loop of expanding your horizons will go into the mid and late game until you reach the political endgame of the Landsrad or the PvP in the deep desert. Just in the early game though, that pivot from the bare necessities to pushing you deeper into danger is as engaging as it can be terrifying, and I think will end up making the gameplay itself pretty thrilling. At this point, I really can't say I've ever felt like the game has encouraged me to rest on my laurels at any point yet. That being said, if you're not the sort to constantly seek out a tense, teeth-gritting experience, playing with friends seems like it will be the way forward. I am a habitual solo player, so the buck stops with me when it comes to anything I need, from water to valuable metals. However, I think if you're in a guild and you have some friends to play with, there's going to be room for different roles through the skill and class progression, and of course games are almost always more fun with friends anyway. Dune Awakening is releasing early this year on PC, and from what I've played of the beta thus far, I think it could be something special in the survival genre. I think the early game experience is possibly one of the most important factors, and in that aspect I think Funcom have hit the ground running. If you're new here, I cover Conan Exiles, and I'll also be covering Dune Awakening as release comes. I'm really looking forward to seeing how Dune Awakening releases and what people think about their first few tentative steps on Arrakis. For more news and hopefully some more sneak peeks as we get closer to Dune Awakening's early access launch, make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you want to see videos early and support the channel directly, consider joining us over on Patreon, link in the description and pinned comment. Take care, and I'll see you soon.